The word pelvic floor is tossed around so much during pregnancy and postpartum. So let's talk about what it even is and how it's affected during these two really important phases in your life. Your pelvic floor is this structure here that is connected to your pelvis. Your pelvic floor is a group of muscles internally and externally lining the pelvis that help support your major organs. A lot of people think about the pelvic floor and just think about these external pelvic floor muscles, these vaginal muscles, but your pelvic floor is much more than just these muscles alone. Your pelvic floor includes these muscles, but it also wraps around to the back of your pelvic floor, which is where your rectum is. And not to mention, there are also internal pelvic floor muscles as well. Those internal pelvic floor muscles and the external pelvic floor muscles are all very much affected and impacted during pregnancy and into postpartum. During pregnancy, because we have this house of our pelvic floor that holds our bladder, our uterus, our bowels, our small intestine, large intestine, those organs, those major organs, your uterus that grows so greatly during pregnancy is housed here. So as soon as we get that growth, that change, that shift in your body, your pelvic floor has to withhold a lot of pressure. And in some cases, the pelvic floor may become too tight that you start having pelvic floor related issues. Or in other cases, it becomes too weak and is not able to hold the weight and the pressure of your growing and changing uterus. But ultimately, your pelvic floor is a foundational layer to your function, especially as a mom, especially during pregnancy, especially during postpartum. So when we have all that pressure and discomfort onto the pelvic floor and these pelvic muscles, and then in turn the core, which is right above and directly connected to the pelvic floor, that can create pelvic floor and core related dysfunction. Some of the most common pelvic floor and core related issues that we see is leaking, incontinence, pain with intercourse, pelvic organ prolapse, which is essentially feeling heaviness in the vagina, bulging out. There can be back pain, abdominal separation, also known as diastasis recti, and so much more. But ultimately, this pelvic floor related dysfunction can lead to things later down the line. It can create lack of function, weakness, debilitating conditions where you aren't able to do the things that you want to do. And so that's why it's really important, and that's why so many people start talking about the pelvic floor during pregnancy, because it is greatly affected. And there are so many other conditions too, and situations where the pelvic floor is also affected, not just pregnancy and postpartum, but moms truly are the ones who have so much more pelvic floor dysfunction than the average other adult who is their age. And while men can definitely have pelvic floor dysfunction and do have pelvic floors, your pelvic floor just really goes through it a lot more during pregnancy and then into postpartum. Your pelvic floor is responsible for lengthening and relaxing during birth. During that pushing phase of labor and delivery, your pelvic floor actually has to lengthen and release, as well as your posterior, those back pelvic floor muscles that help you to relax your butt. But in some cases, because of our poor habits like clenching our butt or sucking in our abdominals or holding our breath for so long, bearing down when we are on the toilet or not relaxing enough when we're on the toilet, having poor bladder habits, a whole heap of things, Kegling when you pee, Kegling all day long. These are all really poor habits that can negatively affect your pelvic floor and in turn affect your pelvic floor function. But so many moms are taught to just Kegel during pregnancy, just Kegel. It's the way that you're gonna have a stronger pelvic floor. And the truth is that while Kegels do serve a purpose, Kegels are not the only answer. Pelvic floor exercises and activating and connecting to the pelvic floor can go well beyond Kegels. And honestly, you can have a deeper connection with your core and your pelvic floor through simply learning diaphragmatic breathing and connecting with your body in this new way, because essentially what Kegels will do sometimes is contract, create so much overstrength in the pelvic floor, and we want to be in the middle of this spectrum. There's a spectrum of super strength in the pelvic floor, too much strength, where it actually causes pelvic floor issues, incontinence, sneezing and leaking as soon as you sneeze, or sneezing with a cough, or laughing so hard that you feel like you're going to pee. This can be a sign of increased tone, increased tightness in some parts of the pelvic floor. There's also this other side of the spectrum where there can be so much weakness in the pelvic floor. But we want to be in the middle where there's strength, where there's function as well, and coordination in the pelvic floor to be able to contract when it needs to, but also to be able to relax and lengthen when it needs to, like during intercourse, so that way you're not having pain and discomfort. And while the pelvic floor is so dynamic, it doesn't just mean that your pelvic floor is just weak and your pelvic floor is just tight. It can be that you have a mix of both. Your pelvic floor can be weak in some areas, but it can also be really overly strong, overactive, hyperactive, some people will say, and that can be in other areas of the pelvic floor. But you can still have both of those things and have pelvic floor dysfunction. So the biggest thing that I like for moms to know is that you can start to prevent or improve pelvic floor related issues or dysfunction at any point. But my recommendation is always the sooner you start connecting to your pelvic floor and working on your pelvic floor, the better.